Do you struggle with invasive species on your property? Or have you ever wondered, what's the big deal with invasive species? Why are they so bad? Or maybe you just wondered how the invasive species got here. I mean, after all, if they are so awful, then why would anyone bring them here? If so, then you aren't alone. And this episode is for you because we talk all about those subjects and others related to invasive species. Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Before we get started, I wanted to thank all of my supporters on Patreon. Their monthly donations help make Backyard Ecology possible. If you would like to join them, you can do so for less than the cost of a cup of coffee or a meal at your favorite fast food place. I'll have links in the show notes for the Backyard Ecology Patreon page, blog, YouTube channel, and email list. Today I'm joined once again by my husband, Anthony. Hi, Anthony. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be back.
You've been on the podcast a few times now, and you've become the face of our YouTube channel. So many of our listeners are probably already familiar with you. But for those who don't know you, would you like to take a couple of minutes to tell people just a little bit about you?
Sure. My name is Anthony, and I have a bachelor's in wildlife biology from Murray State University, Go Racers, master's in agriculture from Western Kentucky University, Go Toppers. And when I am not doing the YouTube channel video thing, I am propagating plants for our nursery, Busy Bee Nursery, and consulting, and also working on consulting projects. And when I have some free time, I try to do the habitat projects around the farm when I get a chance to. And you have to dodge the weather and work it in with everything else. Yeah, and it's fishing season, so it's tough because you want to go fishing. Yeah, crappie are biting.
Yes. And just in case people aren't listening to this at the same time we're recording this, it is late February, early March. And yeah, spring is getting going pretty hard here in Kentucky right now.
But it's always fishing season in Kentucky.
Not too long ago, we did a survey that asked the Backyard Ecology audience, the whole Backyard Ecology audience, whether they listen to the podcast or watch the YouTube videos or read the blog or do some combination of those things. And one of the questions on that survey was, what do you struggle with the most? And the most common answer that we got back was something to do with invasive species, usually identifying and managing them. And people named all kinds of different species, but in general, it was that identifying and managing invasive species. And I don't know about you, but I wasn't really surprised by that because it's really the most common thing we get asked about whenever we talk to people.
Yeah, by far. It's the number one thing that comes up. It doesn't matter if we're at an event, selling plants, even in, like YouTube comments, it's what comes up. It doesn't seem to matter what I do a video on. I'll get a comment about an invasive species on it. So they're a huge topic for sure, and one that people are interested in.
Exactly, because so many people have to deal with them. I mean, we do too. We fully get how frustrating and difficult it can be. We've got plenty ourselves, and we've shown some of those on the videos and talked about them in the blogs and on the podcast before.
Yeah, I mean it's an area wide, countrywide problem. Here in the Southeast, especially, we have basically a 12-month growing season for a lot of the invasives. They don't ever really go dormant, and it gives them a huge advantage. So they're everywhere, and most of the land is disturbed, so they're everywhere. They take advantage of that pretty well.
And you said that it was kind of a regional problem, but or a countrywide problem, but really it's a global issue. Um, there's invasive species all over the world. And in fact, some of our native species and the ones that we love are invasive elsewhere in other parts of the world. So it's just the names change, but the issue remains the same no matter where you go.
Yeah, although I did see something the other day, it seems like we have the distinction of being number one in invasive species for nations on the globe. So, nothing you want to be number one at for sure.
Wow. That surprises me because there are other places that I would have thought would have ranked higher than I mean, I would have expected us to be in the top five, definitely within the top 10, but I wouldn't have guessed number one. But because invasive species are such a common thread and so many of us deal with them, that's why we wanted to take this episode just to talk a little bit about invasive species. But I guess before we go too far, we should think a little bit about defining what is an invasive species.
My definition is it's a species that is not native to where it is growing and it is having an adverse impact on the native ecosystem. So it has to be able to do well enough there to reproduce and proliferate.
And that's pretty much what I go with too. There's actually a legal definition for invasive species. And legally, the definition is an exotic species that's not native to the area that causes or has the potential to cause harm to human health, agriculture, or the ecosystem.
Yeah, if it can reproduce and proliferate at a good rate, chances are it's going to have an impact. I mean, that's just the way it is. The things that can't do that, we don't really know about because they don't survive when they escape. So, you know, you can go out in the woods and see, multifloral rose or burning bush, and it's doing well because it's literally everywhere.
And we tend to talk about invasive species in terms of plants, but in reality, it can be any type of organism. I mean, feral hogs are definitely an invasive species that are having major impacts in the Southeast, especially. Go down to Florida, you've got boas and all kinds of other critters that even slightly further north we don't have to worry about because Florida's kind of its own world when it comes to those things. But I mean, spotted lanternflies are another one that's becoming an increasingly important invasive insect to think about. Hemlock woolly aldelgids, emerald ash borer, chestnut blight. I mean, insects, fungus, mammals, reptiles. There's all kinds of different organisms that are invasive.
Yeah, I mean, feral hogs are a big problem in most of Eastern North America and Southern North America now. And they're actually expanding despite a huge effort to eradicate them by every means you can imagine trapping, aerial gunning, thermal imaging gunning. I mean, they're killing a ridiculous amount of wild hogs every year, and they just keep coming. And that's another part of being an invasive species. They improvise, adapt, and overcome very quickly. They can adjust to whatever's thrown at them, and they're just tough to deal with.
So when we're talking about invasive plants, a lot of times we're looking at taking over the habitat, crowding out other native plants. In the case of hogs, it's a slightly different story. They're disturbing the habitat is a lot of it. Looking at some of the fungi. So like chestnut blight or laurel wilt disease, they're disrupting the way the plant grows. So there's lots of ways that they can cause these impacts too.
Yeah, they all have a little bit different way of how they disturb things. I mean, invasive plants tend to just take up space and outcompete the native plants, become a monoculture. Wild hogs tend to just lower diversity because they literally kill everything, and the disturbance they cause makes it even more prone for invasive plants to move in behind where they've been. So the invasives kind of help each other out sometimes, which isn't good. I mean, that's bad.
Exactly. The disturbance that they cause allows for the invasive plants to more easily move in.
Yeah, they're basically like little bulldozer. I mean, when you have a herd of hogs go through, the ground looks like you tilled it. I mean, it's basically anything that was growing there's gone. and you have fresh bare dirt, which is just like an invasive plant. That's what they want. They're going to take that over.
So I've heard before, and I know you've heard it too, that people will say, well, diversity's good. So if we've got new species coming in, isn't that a good thing? Why does it matter if a species is invasive?
The problem comes from the fact that they have no natural enemies, and they tend to have some trait beyond that that helps them outcompete native plants. So a lot of our woody invasives in the southeast, they either don't lose their leaves in the wintertime or they leaf out incredibly early and lose their leaves incredibly late. So they have a huge energy advantage over our native plants. And they tend to form a monoculture. So in the end, you're reducing diversity. In areas where you have a lot of invasives, you might have 3 or 4 invasive plants where you used to have 200 species of native plants. So your diversity just went down. And hogs do the same thing. They kill everything. So where there's hogs, the diversity of not just plants, animals, herps, fungus, everything, it just drops. It doesn't work the way you would think it works.
Right. Today, it may be one extra species, but in 5 years, sometimes a lot less than that, you're minus 200 species or something ridiculous like that. And the other thing that I've heard, especially when we're talking about plants, is but what if things use it? So people see the birds eating the berries of, say, the bush honeysuckle, or pollinators visiting some of the flowers. And so it gives the impression, at least on the short term, that these things might be good or helpful, but it doesn't quite work that way because, like you said, they're forming these monocultures. So taking the flowers, for instance, those flowers don't bloom year round. They bloom at one particular instant in time. So there might be a big boost in floral resources at that time. But for the rest of the year, there's nothing else there for the pollinators to go to the plants for at all. Whereas without those, they may have had 20, 30, depending on how large the space is, 100 different species that they could potentially have visited. And not all pollinators go to all flowers. So we're assuming that all flowers are equal with that, and it's not. So even if you've got a huge abundance of an invasive species blooming, all the pollinators that can't use those particular flowers, they're just out of luck at any time of the year. The generalists may be able to visit some of those flowers for that particular time, but then, like I said, the rest of the year they've got nothing. Whereas if that invasive species wasn't there, it was native plants, they would have multiple other species blooming during other times of the year to create that year-round habitat. Birds eating the berries. Yes, some of our invasive species, the birds will eat the berries on, but a lot of times those berries don't have the same fat content, protein content that our native berries that are available at the same time have. So you're not getting the same nutritional value that you would from native plants that have berries at the same time. And of course, if your nutrition isn't there, that causes problems. Like one of the big things I've seen a lot of research studies on with birds and berries is fall migration. And during the fall migration, they need a lot of fat for a lot of energy. And a lot of the invasive species that have berries at the same time, their sugar content's up, but not the fat content that the birds need at that particular moment in time.
Yeah, and a lot of times the animals are using it because it's the only thing available. If you've got a 30-acre field and 80% of the plants in that field are autumn olive, we'll just use that as an example. Of course, things are going to use it because they don't really have a choice. So the pollinators are going to visit the flowers, and in the fall, the birds are going to eat the autumn olive berries because that's all they've got. And it doesn't matter if it's a super good food source. There are very few animals that eat one thing. And the animals that are like that eat one thing are very restricted in their range and are always in peril of getting wiped out if their one thing goes away. So most animals are kind of generalist in a group of foods. So berry eating birds are going to eat a whole bunch of different berries, and that's good for them. Diversity in diet is also good. You know, broccoli is a great food, but if all you ate was broccoli, you would have problems.
Hmm.
You know, you have to have other things to eat, and so do the critters. At least 99.9% of them have to have other things to eat.
Definitely. Which is why it's so important to try and get rid of invasive species. And we're not talking about these invasive species as they're just inherently bad species, because they're not. Where they originated from, they often play a very important role in that ecosystem. It's that they've been moved over here to a completely new ecosystem where they don't have those close ties and relationships with everything else that has been here. And so it becomes an issue there. And that's what gives them that unfair competitive advantage and lets them take over and cause all those issues. And some of our favorite plants here have been moved to other parts of the world, and they are now invasive species there. So it goes both ways. It's not that these plants are inherently evil or awful or bad. It's just where they're at and the fact that they don't function as part of the system.
Yeah, red maple is an invasive species in Asia. They have a huge problem with it. We have a lot of problems with Asian species here, and the reason is we're at the same latitude. So, you know, Asia and us sit at the same. Basically, we're the same spot on the globe if you go look north and south. So there's a reason that a lot of their plants are end up invasive here, and a lot of our stuff ends up invasive there. But they also have a lot of plants that are in the same genus as plants we have here. So you know, there's a reason that some that these things do well in each other's spots. You know,
Exactly. And somewhere I read, and this was a few years ago, and I haven't been able to find it since, but somewhere I read that Coreopsis is an invasive species in Japan. It's like one of their top 10 invasive species. And that's one of the ones that I was like, really? Because I don't even think of Coreopsis as being super competitive. I mean, it's relatively short lived unless it's in a garden setting that you're really maintaining and trying to propagate it. But out in the field, it's not your most common, most long lived native wildflower out there. And yet over there, yeah, it apparently does really, really well. And that's not a good thing.
yeah, it's more of a pioneer type plant here. You see it, you know, early on, and then once the tougher perennials get going, it's gone. You know,
Yeah, it kind of fades out. You'll see it pop up here and there, but not a lot of it.
yeah, it doesn't strike me as a super competitive plant here. It does well, but it's easy to grow,
Hmm.
but I don't find it out in the wild too often. Not in very established grassland type communities. It gets out competed.
But that's where, like we were saying, once you take things out of their native habitat, things change sometimes. And it really does go either direction. These plants aren't bad. The insects aren't bad. The fungus aren't bad. It's just not in the right place anymore. And doesn't have all the natural checks and balances.
Yeah. Here, they're bad. I mean, you're not going to hear me say anything nice about tree of heaven growing in North America. No, not one word. No,
No,
you'll never see me say, "Boy, I love this multifloral rose thicket," as I take a machete to it and stump cut treat it. But you know, here they're bad news.
yes.
You know, but where they're native to, they have their place in that ecosystem. But I would love to know what Tree of Heavens is, because I have seen zero redeeming qualities for it here in North America.
Yes, here they're bad, but that's because they're away from their where they originated, away from their ecosystem. But kind of sticking with the plants because that's what as homeowners most of us deal with the most and what we arguably have the greatest ability to fight on our properties, I think.
Yeah, unless you are a rancher with a lot of land, you're probably not dealing with feral hogs or anything like that. You're not going to go out and fight any of the funguses on your own. Um, Plants are about the major thing you can have a direct impact on.
Right. So I've got a question for you. And this is going to sound a little strange, but it's one that I've been asked before. And I think I know what you're going to say because it's basically what I would say with it. But can a native plant be an invasive species?
If it is growing within its native range, no. If it is growing outside of its native range, and that could literally be the county next door to where you're at because it has a different ecoregion falling across it, yes.
Exactly. It comes down to the definition of native and how we define native. And for me, and pretty sure this is basically the way you define it as well, native is a species that has evolved in that location. And so it's got all of the relationships with all the other organisms that are there that naturally come with pretty much always having been there. And so it has those deep inherent relationships and connections going on. And so, like you said, if you take a species native to, well, false indigo bush, not Baptisia, Amorpha, Amorpha, false indigo bush. This is actually a shrub. It's a bushy type plant. It is native to much of the eastern US. It is not native to parts of New England, but it can be a very showy plant. And so it has been moved up into parts of New England and it's become invasive there and it's causing issues there because it was never there before. And so it is then acting very much like a invasive species because it is in that respect.
Yeah, another one would be red cedar. They're having huge troubles with it out on the prairies because there was never red cedar on the prairies. But with fire suppression these days, red cedar is spreading and it will monoculture. You'll actually have it looks like a field of nothing but red cedar, which is really bad. I really don't care what part of the red cedars range you're in. A solid block of red cedar is not a good thing because nothing lives underneath it. It's just nothing but cedars. But out there, it's a huge problem. They actually have bounties on them now, where you can go out and get paid to kill cedar trees. And it's not like they're little cedars. I mean, they get big very quickly. And growing out there with nothing but grass around them, they look like Christmas trees. I mean, they're very full all the way to the ground, so there's nothing. And you know, and I've seen people get mad because they're killing all the cedar trees, and I'm like, well, they're not supposed to be there. It's supposed to be grass. It's a prairie. It is a tall grass prairie. It is supposed to be grass.
Yes. And it's actually the red cedar that made me really stop and think more deeply about that question because a lot of times we talk about native species as being native to a region, so the eastern US, and that's where we get in trouble with things like the false indigo bush because it's native to most of the eastern US, but not a few states in the New England upper Northeast. So that becomes an issue. Or we talk about native to a state. And when you get to things like the eastern red cedar, some of those states where it's becoming a major issue in the prairies, it is native to that state. It's just not native to that particular ecosystem and the prairie ecosystems. So there are parts of the state where the red cedars would naturally be growing. And then there's other parts of the state where, since we've taken out these disturbance factors that would have naturally kept the red cedar out and limited it, it is now an invasive species there. So we can't even talk about it at a statewide level. This really does come down to looking at things at a very minute level sometimes and not trying to overcomplicate it. But we really do have to focus on those ecosystems and those ecoregions. And what would this have been like, and what are we now allowing to come into that area because we've removed disturbance factors that may have been there, or increased in disturbance factors that may not have originally been there. I'm sure it could go the other way as well.
Yeah, fire suppression has done a lot to plant communities across the eastern United States, especially because we have a lot of people and you can't have fires burning through everything. And fire was bad forever, the whole Smoky Bear era. So we have stuff growing in a lot of the east that we would have never really had growing. Like the county we live in is covered in cedar trees. This used to be known as the Barrens. It did not have trees practically at all. It had scattered trees and shrub thickets and grasslands, or forblands, but it was burned a lot. So the cedar trees weren't around. You can drive around anywhere now, and there's cedar trees everywhere. They're not fire tolerant. If you have fire, they go up like a Roman candle. It's really cool. But now they're everywhere. So the whole plant community's changed. And when you start getting that cedar cover, especially on ridges that would have been dry, you then get the maples and the beeches and the tulip poplars that are able to grow and outcompete the cedars eventually. And you end up with a moist type, a mesic type forest on top of a ridge that probably never had mesic type anything growing on it. So nothing looks the same. I mean, 400 years ago, things were way different.
Which I've never really liked the idea of saying that in a garden setting, a native plant could be invasive. I've always said, no, it's aggressive. And I still use that term. But as we're having these conversations and are thinking about the whole issue, like with Eastern red cedar, and really defining it down to particular ecosystems, it really makes me stop and think, well, maybe invasive isn't as bad of a term for highly aggressive plants in a garden setting as I used to think it was, because, well, garden setting isn't their natural habitat either, or where it would be. So I've become a lot more lenient over the last few years as I've really started thinking about this in different terms and really think, well, maybe that's not as bad as I thought it was, but it's still not my preferred way of talking about the really aggressive plants, even in a garden setting.
Yeah, I like to think of them as competitive.
Yeah, that's a good way.
They're very competitive. And the other thing with a garden setting is you might be planting stuff in soil that it's not natively growing in. And sometimes you take a plant that doesn't really get competitive in hard, baked, dry, low productivity soil and you stick it in a nice composted garden and it just takes off. That happens sometimes. Sometimes it kills them. They can't handle it. They just die. But other times they go crazy. Cup plants kind of like that. I mean, it's pretty competitive even out in the wild. I mean, it's a big plant, but I don't see just solid stands of cup plant. But you put it in a garden setting and it's going to outcompete everything it's growing with. It's going to be the only thing left standing, which, if you like cup plant,
Yeah, but still, it's only one, it's still a monoculture. It's only producing the flowers, it's only producing the seeds, it's only doing the things for one period in time, and then there's nothing else out there. But the other thing with garden settings is that we don't always have all the plants that would have naturally been growing together. We pick and choose because it's something that we're creating ourselves. So they don't even have their natural competition and their natural checks and balances to keep them in place. So that allows some of them to be more aggressive or more competitive than they might naturally be in a more natural setting.
yeah, I mean, people tend to pick the things that are pretty for the garden, even though, when you're planting a pollinator garden, there's things that go beyond what's just the most beautiful plant I can put out there, such as they should include some grasses in that garden, which will help keep some of that more competitive stuff in check because that grass is not going to get out competed. It might just be a clump forming grass like little blue stem, but there are very few forbs that are going to be able to unseat that clump of little blue stem. It is going to stay there.
And believe me, we do the same thing around in our gardens too. We're putting the things that are pretty, we're putting the things that we like that will grow well together. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's the same plant combinations we would see naturally either. It's just human nature. That's what we do, especially around our homes.
Yeah, planning around a house is a whole different ball game than going out on the back 40 and saying, "Hey, we're going to put some quail habitat out here. So let's plant a plant community that quail will use." It's going to look a lot different. It's probably not something you would want in your front yard. Maybe you would. If you do, that's great. I'm all for it. But there's differences there.
Right. And I think those subtleties get lost sometimes in conversations, especially when you're having conversations where there are some people that have a garden setting and that's all they've got. And then other people that have more acreage and have either a larger pollinator planting that they're working with, or like you said, have large enough acreage to be looking at something like managing for quail or some of these animals that require more land.
Yeah, and where your house is has a bearing on it too. I mean, if you live in a subdivision with an HOA, you're probably not going to be able to get as crazy with something as like where we live. We live in the county. We're way back off the road. I mean, we literally could plant quail habitat in our front yard, and a lot of times it kind of looks like that anyway. But a lot of it depends on your situation of where your house is. But the important thing is plant stuff that's native to where you live. Don't plant anything that's invasive that is a problem. And there's plenty of lists for that out there. Every state's got one.
Yeah, that's what I was going to move to next is how do you know if a species is invasive in your area? Because it's really hard to get rid of invasives or not plant them if you don't know what they are. But yeah, like Anthony was saying, every state pretty much has a list. The best way I know to find out what is invasive in your area, especially for plants, is do an internet search for whatever your state is, invasive plant pest council. And there's probably going to be a list. They're updated every 7, 10 years, something like that, usually. And if you can't find it there, your Fish and Wildlife usually has a pretty good list as well.
NRCS office will have it for sure. They've got it.
Yep.
You'll probably be able to figure out what's invasive because it's what's growing the best. I hate to say it, but you just drive down the road and like this time of year, it's getting a little late. Everything else is starting to leaf out, but everything that's got green leaves on it, chances are 90% of that's probably invasive species, and you'll get good at picking them out after a while. But
Okay, let's say someone's walking around their property and they find a plant that's invasive. Now what? How would you suggest that they go forward from there?
if you are new to dealing with invasive species, I would contact your extension office or your NRCS office and get some help because some of them you can pull out of the ground and they'll die. Some of them you'll pull out of the ground and you'll just make them mad and they're gonna sprout from every broken root. Some of them, if you cut it down, you're not gonna kill any of them by just cutting them down, especially woody ones. But some of them you can set back. Some of them will root sprout with a vengeance, like tree of heaven. You cut down a tree of heaven, and you're going to have hundreds of root sprouts. You just multiplied your problem by several orders of magnitude. And I've talked to a lot of people who have done that. I've consulted on places where people have done that, and you just took a problem that you could have solved with 5 minutes and some basil spray to hours and hours and hours with basil spray, spraying little tiny plants instead of one big one. So you have to have a coordinated attack on it, and you have to know what you're dealing with, how you can deal with it, how big the problem is. I mean, if you own a residential lot, how you deal with it's probably going to differ from somebody that's got 200 acres. You know, you might be able to pull enough of them out of your residential lot and kill them. Somebody with 200 acres is going chemical means definitely, or they're going to be fighting it for the next. They're going to be dead before they're done with that problem, just because it's going to take them 50 years.
And like, I mean, one of the things that we're doing on our property, well, we don't have 200 acres, but we've got a little less than 40 acres. So we have a decent sized property. And one of the things that we're doing on ours is we're kind of picking a spot and working there and then kind of expanding out. Because if we try to do everything at once, it's overwhelming. The other thing you could do is pick one species and work there because not all invasive species are equal. I mean, there are some really, really horrible ones that spread really fast. There's others that aren't as bad. So it's almost like triaging. It's what can I do now? What can make the biggest difference in the long run? Or if you have a new one come in and it's one single plant or a handful of plants, get rid of it right then. Don't let it get a foothold. And that's just going to save you problems down the road.
Yeah, when it comes to finding a new one popping up, it comes down to, the Cobra Kai motto, to quote a TV show, strike first, strike hard, no mercy. It just, that's the way it has to be. If you've got something that just pops up, you need to get rid of it now. Because some of them can, tree of heaven, if it makes seeds, you're going to have a huge problem. Multiflora rose, if it makes seeds, you're going to have a huge problem. Japanese stilt grass, if it makes seeds, you're going to have a problem for the next 10 years. So you just need to get them quick. Now, chances are, if you buy property out in the country, acreage, you're going to have plenty of invasive species. I haven't been on a place yet that has been pristine and has had no invasive species. Pretty much every place has got them now, even residential lots in town, because they are disturbing the soil when they build those houses, and they sometimes fill it with soil from someplace else, and they bring wonderful presents with them. So I don't think we've ever consulted on a property where we have seen zero invasive species. It's usually at least, I'd say at least 8 to 10 species on the average property, easily, and some way more than that.
Definitely. Although you and I need to have a conversation after this recording's over about what a wonderful present is, because I don't think our definitions are the same based on what you just said.
Well, no, no, that was sarcasm. I know it doesn't come across on the computer very well, but yeah, yeah,
No, I'm just giving you a hard time and pointing that out in case anybody else
I know.
missed the sarcasm.
If they've watched any of my videos, they're used to the sarcasm. So,
Good point.
yeah.
And another thing with invasive species eradication and removal that I don't think gets brought up as often as it should, and I think this is a very important point, is that you don't want to just remove the invasive species. Once you've got the invasive species out, you want to replace that plant with something else that's desirable. Don't leave the space empty, because all you're going to do is allow another different type of invasive species potentially to come in, because, well, there's that old saying, nature abhors a vacuum. We don't have empty spaces in nature like that usually. Something's going to come in. Make sure it's something that you want to come in that's coming in.
Yeah, yeah, you will definitely get something coming in quickly, and chances are it's not going to be native. It almost never is, especially if you disturb the soil. I know a lot of people love weed wrenching shrubby invasives out of the ground because it doesn't use chemicals, but it disturbs the soil greatly. And that is just invasive party time right there. And there's going to be seeds from that plant in the ground. They're all going to sprout. The less you can disturb it while you're getting rid of it, usually the better. And if you can get something growing quickly that you want, and this is where plugs really come in handy, because if you got to wait for the seeds to germinate on some of these natives, it takes them forever to germinate. Whereas the invasive species seed has been laying there in the soil for 2 years, is ready to go. Boom. It's got light, it's got warm soil, it germinates. So if you can get something in the ground that's a plug, or, potted stock, or even bare root, whatever, just, it's already big, it's going to start growing. But yeah, you got to get on it quick.
So, anything else that you think we should talk about as far as methodology or timing and stuff like that? Because each invasive species is different and has its own set of ways that it can be controlled. And then, like you said, the practical applications of those methods is going to be different depending on where you're at, what size property you have, all kinds of other things. So it's really hard to get into the details. And I know that's what everybody wants, but in a general conversation like this, it's almost impossible because Each species is different. Each circumstance that we're looking at as homeowners or property owners is different. But in general, is there anything else that we need to talk about before we move into the next subject about invasive species?
No, beyond identify what you're dealing with, the scope of the problem. Are they younger plants? Are they older plants? Um, that's all stuff whoever you're trying to get advice from is going to need to know because it's going to have a huge impact on how you deal with it. I mean, if you got multifloral rows and it's just little bitty sprigs coming out of the ground, they don't have a root system on them hardly at all. You can just pop them right out just by grabbing them with gloves. You can be done with it. But if you have a 2 acre thicket that you can't walk through and can't see through, you're going to have to do a herbicide application of some kind probably to get rid of that. Time of year is going to make a difference. Are you going to foliar apply it? You're going to cut stump apply it? Or are you going to hire a forestry mulcher to just grind it to the ground and wait for it to resprout and deal with it then? There's a lot of things to think about when you're dealing with invasive species. Now, a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is big scale because I deal with a lot bigger scale. So I think about, acres of invasive species or hundreds of acres of invasive species, which, is kind of stuff you have nightmares about. But dealing with it on a smaller property, a lot of times they're younger plants and you can deal with them differently. Or you got one or two big plants, a bush honeysuckle or a big Elaeagnus or a huge tree of heaven somebody planted 30 years ago as a shade tree. And they do exist and they're terrible because they spread seeds everywhere. But that's my main advice is you really just need to get an idea of what you're dealing with. And then if you don't understand how to take care of it, go talk to somebody that can give you an idea of what to do.
Right. There's lots of resources out there for learning how to deal with these, but it is very much a case by case basis. I mean, there's some general guidelines, but it is going to vary by the species that you're working with, by little property, big property, little infestation, big infestation. So, for example, you've been talking a lot about big properties. I'm going to take it to smaller properties in town because there are a ton of invasive species in town, even. And sometimes you may not have complete control over the invasive species in your property. Say where your neighbor has a lot of winter creeper, which is a situation that we see all the time and that I talk to in a lot of the consulting work that I do in towns is that the neighbor has winter creeper and it's coming under the fence. And so you may not be able to go in and just cut down the mother tree or the mother vine. And so then you have to deal with it in other ways. And how you do that. And like I said, it really does depend. We all hate that answer, but that's the most truthful answer there is.
Yeah, a lot of the woodies are trouble in residential areas because they were planted for so long and still are to some extent as landscape plants.
Mm-hmm.
So, you got tons of them and you also have a ton of seed because they've probably been there a while. It's the hardest part with residential properties is dealing with the seed bank because it's there and it's been there for a while.
Which kind of leads us into the other topic that I thought we might want to just chat about for a minute or two. And that is, how did these invasive species get here to begin with? Because nobody said, ooh, this is an invasive species. It's going to cause problems. Let me bring it and plant it. Or let me bring it and introduce it. That was not the case at all. And so I think it might be fun to just chat for a minute about some of these invasive species and how they got here and why they're here.
A lot of the plants started out as landscape plants. Winter creeper, burning bush, tree of heaven, English ivy. Um, I mean, it just goes on and on. Even multifloral rose. It wasn't necessarily used as a landscape plant, although I mean, it's got pretty flowers on it, but it was used as rootstock for garden roses because it's a easy to grow, tough rootstock. So it wasn't even the whole plant they were trying to use. It was just, 8 inches of it at the bottom to graft a rose to. But that's where a lot of them came from. Some of them were brought in for other purposes like erosion control or, things like that. A lot of the animals were brought in as food or pets and they escaped. And a lot were just plain accidents.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. There's been a lot of accidental introductions too. So, I mean, it really varies. That's why there's so many regulations as to what you can bring in and why things get stopped at the border so often to get inspected because they're trying to keep out organisms that could become invasive and cause issues in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't really have any of that back in the day. So you imported something, it went straight off the boat and into the port, and off it went to whoever bought it. And they didn't really look at things. And that's how we ended up with Japanese beetles. They came in on the roots of imported horticulture stock from Japan. And nobody looked at them. It would be easy to see those big, huge grubs inside some roots. They just didn't inspect it. So chestnut blight, laurel wilt, they got here accidentally, but in imported plant material.
So a lot of times it's accidents. And that's why we, like I said, we have to be so careful with that.
And sometimes it was just because of agricultural practices. I mean, feral hogs, they literally used to just let hogs run wild, and they would go out and round them up and catch the hogs. That's how they raised them in a lot of the southern part of the country, especially. And of course, they didn't always catch them all. So, now we've got feral hogs.
Or I was going to say sometimes they did look at things. So the one that just popped into my mind was the whole Bradford pear calorie pear issue. And I mean, with that, they looked and they said, okay, this pear is sterile. It does not produce fruit, which that particular cultivar did not. But they didn't realize they could cross pollinate with another type of pear. And then that's where we get the issues that we do with the pears spreading. Purple loosestrife is a huge issue in wetlands. And it was introduced multiple times in the horticulture industry. And it was supposed to be sterile. Nature finds a way. And it wasn't as sterile as they thought it was. And it doesn't take very many non-sterile ones to start to cause a major, major issue.
Yeah, and I get worried anytime I see something catching on that's non-native and everybody's planting it because it supposedly can't spread. Those are the magic watchwords I always look at when it says can't possibly breed in the wild. I get terrified by it. And right now, giant miscanthus is like all the rage in the deer hunting world for planting is screening to get into tree stands and block views from food plots because it's supposed to be sterile and cannot reproduce on its own. And I'm terrified we're going to be fighting a miscanthus problem here in the next 20 years when it crosses with some other miscanthus because it's planted as an ornamental grass too, and that sterile plant suddenly becomes like the calorie pears do, and we've got it everywhere because they have windborne seed. So I always worry about those things because it happened. It just seems to happen over and over again. It's like, folks, so when are we going to learn it's not going to stay sterile? Chances are, because nature's going to find a way to continue making life.
So again, it's just one of those other things to think about as you dig deeper into invasive species and invasive species management. I mean, there aren't easy answers here. And we try to learn from our mistakes. And sometimes we learn better than we do than at other times. But hopefully we can start to make a little bit of a difference with some of them.
Yeah, and I don't want people to think that anything that's not native to an area is terrible and horrible because there are tons of plants that we grow that don't become invasive.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that like less than 1/3 of 1% of all the plants that are out there in the horticulture world that are exotic and not native to even the nation. So this is expanding that definition of native out even further than you and I usually use it. But less than 1/3 of 1% are actually invasive. And that's just with plants. So we're talking about very, 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 very minuscule portion of the plants that are out there that can cause problems. But those problems are millions of dollars every year worth of problems.
Yeah, I mean, if you couldn't plant anything that was not native to the United States, let's say, because you're worried about it becoming invasive. You couldn't have a vegetable garden. You couldn't grow hardly any fruit because in the world of agricultural crops and commodities, things native to the United States that are actual worldwide importance, there's like one, and it's blueberries. Nothing else is really native here. And I think maybe a couple plums have been bred to be fruit producers that are native to North America. But beyond that, there aren't a whole lot of food crops that are from here. I mean, corn, but farther south, that's more of a Mesoamerican crop. South America has a bunch, but North America, um, no, blueberries. That's probably the most economically important native food from what would be the United States.
Now, I mean, if you want to go into the food foraging and the ethnobotany and stuff like that, there are definitely plants that are native to every region that have been used for food by indigenous people for forever, basically. But those aren't the ones that are commercially available. And you don't go to the grocery store and find them. They're not the foods that I would say a lot of us have grown up eating or are familiar with or even recognize as food in many cases.
Yeah, you're not going to go to the grocery store and find pawpaws, let's say.
Well, depending on where you're at and which grocery store, it's starting to be able to find sometimes, but not like massively.
You might find them at a farmer's market, but their shelf life is like 48 hours. So they're not a crop that's ever going to be a huge fruit source. They don't fit the modern model of food supply. Yeah, and, a lot of the foods that the Native Americans ate were very regional, and they still are because that's where they're native to. But you're not going to go out into the wild and find green beans growing anywhere around here or squash, unless your compost pile has them growing out of it, like they
Like
tend to
ours.
do. Yeah, squash are tough. I'm kind of surprised they haven't found a way to exist out in the wild, but they don't.
Well, hopefully this has helped some people think through invasive species a little bit and kind of get an idea of what an invasive species is, why they cause issues, some of the things to think about when trying to control them on your property. We all want to get rid of them, but that's really, really hard to do if you have much property size at all, or if you've got a neighbor with them. I mean, even small properties that are in town can have just as big of invasive species issues because they are so small and so much of their property can be impacted by neighbors and what's planted next door or nearby. But yeah, hopefully this conversation has helped some people. And thank you so much, Anthony, for joining us today.
Oh, it was fun being here. It always is.
And for anybody that's listening, if you haven't checked out the YouTube channel, I highly encourage you to do so. Anthony's got lots of different videos on there about native plants, native insects, birds, and stuff like that. I mean, we talk about a lot of different things, and we talk about invasive species as well on there. So lots of information for you to check out and hopefully find something that will help you some more. But yeah, thanks a lot, Anthony, and have a great day.
You too.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I appreciate Anthony once again taking the time to talk with us. Invasive species are something that most of us struggle with. And while these species aren't inherently bad and can be valuable members of their native ecosystems, they cause significant damage in the locations where they are invasive. This is because they have been moved out of context and don't have any of the natural checks and balances that they would have in their native locations. And while sometimes you may see species of pollinators or wildlife visiting the flowers or eating the fruit, the overall negative impacts that they have far outweigh any short-term or seasonal uses that wildlife or pollinators may get from them. Anthony and I barely scratched the surface of all the impacts that invasive species can have, or how those impacts often ripple out in ways that aren't always immediately obvious. It would have been very easy for us to have continued this conversation for another hour or two, which is why we sometimes also offer classes on invasive species where we can have more in-depth and detailed discussions about specific plants and ways to manage them under different scenarios. Let us know if that's something that you would like to see us offer again in the near future. If you haven't checked out the Backyard Ecology YouTube channel, then I encourage you to do so. Anthony adds new content every week. I'll have a link in the show notes for the Backyard Ecology YouTube channel. And until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.